The story begins with the sudden collapse of normalcy. A total blackout that plunges the neighborhood into darkness. Refrigerators, air conditioners, and streetlights all die at once, leaving silence so deep it feels as though the town itself has been unplugged. Only one house remains aglow, the protagonist's, powered by a generator prepared long before the crisis. The hum of its engine stands out in the silence like a stubborn heartbeat. With that sound, the line between the prepared and the unprepared is drawn, and into that division storms Karen, the longtime antagonist, armed with a flashlight in one hand and a clipboard in the other. In the eerie blue glow, she screams at the gate that the generator is no longer private property but belongs to the community, citing imaginary bylaws that demand its redistribution. From his porch, the protagonist watches her perform, calm coffee cup in hand, and with a press of his remote, the gate clangs shut, sealing her outside as if a fortress wall had fallen between them. The initial confrontation quickly escalates into farce and menace at once. Karen yanks on cords, scrapes against the steel gate, and shouts promises to return with authorities. Her allies, two shadowy figures lurking near the fence line, attempt to sneak in, only to be blasted by floodlights and chased off like startled deer. Each attempt at intimidation fails, but rather than retreating, she grows more desperate. Her voice carries through the blackout night, shrill with entitlement and rage, insisting this is about community survival, when in truth it is about power, about hating that his lights are on while hers are not. The protagonist lets the cameras do the work, each failed trespass and each muffled whisper preserved as evidence. Already, a chess game is forming. She lunges emotionally while he counters with quiet patience and documentation. The following days bring escalations that reveal her obsession. She sends emails in the HOA's name, inventing protocols demanding private generators be surrendered. She mobilizes allies, including her cousin the electrician, who attempts to cut wires and quietly sabotage the system. Yet the protagonist has anticipated all of this. With cunning foresight, he installs a decoy generator outside the fence, wired with alarms and cameras, while his real power source hums safely locked in the shed. Saboteurs swarm to the bait, only to be exposed by blinding lights and captured on film. Each attempt collapses into embarrassment, a cousin tripping through hedges, accomplices scattering, Karen caught crouching in the mud with pruning shears to cut inverter wires. And each collapse strengthens the protagonist's case, adding evidence and witness testimony. When direct sabotage fails, Karen leans on fabricated authority. She dispatches liaisons in orange vests to pose as inspectors, and even hires men in security jackets to march at her side like a private militia. She stages theatrical HOA bulletins, community drills, and even a nighttime parade with reflective vests and megaphones declaring the generator seized for redistribution. Yet the absurd pantomime backfires. Neighbors gather quietly in doorways, phones raised, recording the spectacle. Her recruits hesitate, glancing nervously at the crowd and retreating when pressed. Meanwhile, the homeowner continues to offer quiet assistance. Freezer space for medicine, charging stations for families, water for weary parents. Without fanfare, he builds loyalty where she tramples it, exposing the gap between Karen's rhetoric of community and the reality of her self-serving control. The battle then shifts to legal warfare. Karen files HOA complaints, spreads rumors, and eventually elevates the matter to county inspection. Officials arrive, investigate, and leave with nothing to support her. Finally, in a dramatic escalation, she files an emergency court motion to confiscate the generator for community necessity. In the dim courthouse, she delivers fiery speeches portraying herself as the savior of suffering neighbors. Yet when the judge reviews the evidence, video of nighttime sabotage, footage of her cutting wires, permits showing the generator fully legal, affidavits from neighbors whom he had quietly helped, the case crumbles. Karen's theatrics wilt against the calm precision of documented fact. The ruling is decisive. Her motion denied, a restraining order imposed, and a hearing for damages from her harassment scheduled. The courtroom, like the storm, proves to be an impartial force that strips illusion from reality. The climax and resolution arrive not with shouting or violence but with the quiet collapse of her power. Returning to the street after court, the protagonist finds neighbors openly supportive, offering thanks and even food in gratitude. Karen's house, once the center of HOA edicts, now sits shuttered, her SUV gone, her blinds drawn. When she makes one last desperate nighttime raid, arriving with pickup trucks, security men, and a proclamation folder, the sheriff intercepts mid-act. Her allies refuse to risk arrest. Her folder drops uselessly to the pavement, and she herself is handcuffed and driven away while neighbors film from their windows. The siege is over. Days later, as the county grid crackles back to life, the neighborhood gathers for a barbecue. Not out of enforced solidarity but true cooperation. The protagonist opens his gate freely for the first time in a week, not as surrender but as community. In the end, the Blackout reveals more than it conceals. It exposes how fragile Karen's paper empire had been, propped up by fear and bluster, undone by preparation, legality, and quiet generosity. What begins as a petty bid to steal a generator unfolds into a week-long siege, escalating from trespass to sabotage to legal theatrics and finally collapsing in handcuffs. Yet the resolution does not feel like triumph, but calm vindication. The lesson is simple but enduring. Preparation outlasts panic, truth outlasts theatrics, and calm sovereignty endures long after false authority burns itself out. The Blackout story is not merely about lights going off in a neighborhood. It is about a clash of worldviews exposed under pressure. At its heart lies the theme of preparedness versus entitlement, a timeless conflict where foresight collides with opportunism. The homeowner had spent years preparing, a generator hidden in a shed, permits in a folder, fuel cans properly stored, even a decoy machine rigged with alarms in case of tampering. His resilience was not luck but deliberate work, stacking layers of safety for an inevitable day when the grid would fail. Karen, on the other hand, arrived empty-handed with nothing but entitlement. She brought no fuel, no plan, no backup for her own home. Instead, she carried a flashlight, a clipboard, and a conviction that other people's effort could be seized with the right words. The Blackout did not suddenly make him selfish. It revealed the difference between one who invests in preparation and one who waits for someone else's to exploit. Parallel to this is the struggle of authority versus sovereignty. Karen represents the hollow authority of the HOA, an institution obsessed with bylaws, fines, and a sprawling sense of control. Inside the walls of meetings, her language and regulations held weight. She could dictate fence heights or mailbox colors with smug impunity. But sovereignty, the homeowner's legal ownership of his property reinforced by county permits and reinforced gates, proved immovable. Karen stormed against that sovereignty with clipboards, fake inspectors, and even staged security vests. Yet each attempt crashed against the hard reality that her guidelines had no jurisdiction beyond the HOA boundary. When county inspectors and judges confirmed the generator's legality and the property's boundaries, authority built on theater collapsed while sovereignty anchored in documents and preparation stood firm. The Blackout was the great amplifier, showing how flimsy organizational control becomes when placed against lawful ownership. The contrast between control and generosity cut even deeper. Karen shouted constantly about community, insisting that fairness required redistribution. Yet her definition of fairness was always control under her supervision. She sought power to decide whose fridge stayed cold, whose air would run, or which neighbor deserved electricity. The homeowner, meanwhile, demonstrated generosity without control. He allowed neighbors to store medicine in his freezer, to charge phones, even to run medical devices on his inverter, all without demanding obedience or allegiance. Acts of quiet kindness undermined Karen's entire platform. Her furious declarations began to look absurd when compared to his calm assistance, and neighbors slowly drifted into his orbit not because he coerced them, but because he simply helped them. The Blackout thus became a moral mirror. Karen used community as a pretext to expand her rule, while he practiced it as a natural extension of self-reliance. The fourth theme, illusion versus reality, is perhaps the most striking. Karen's tools were illusions: clipboards, megaphones, fake security uniforms, hastily drafted bylaws taped to gates. They looked official until anyone pushed against them. Each illusion unraveled the moment real-world reality pushed back. Loud alarms from the decoy generator, cameras exposing her cousin in the act of sabotage, county inspectors ruling his equipment legal, judges silencing her speeches with hard evidence. In contrast, the homeowner dealt only in reality. Camera footage, signed permits, eyewitness statements, chains that refused to cut. All these were irrefutable facts. The Blackout stripped away the smoke and mirrors, showing whose authority was rooted in something tangible. Karen's clipboard turned laughable before a mounted camera's unblinking lens, and her megaphone slogans became noise against the hum of a generator that kept breathing through the crisis. Finally, the saga embodies the collapse of a petty tyranny. Karen had ruled her HOA through intimidation and constant meddling. Petty fines over bird feeders, nitpicking over lawns, dictating paint shades. She thrived in the controlled setting of monthly meetings where neighbors feared her capacity for enforcement. But the blackout became her undoing because it shifted the playing field to one she could not control. Darkness, silence, and survival. Each time she escalated, trespassing, staging fake officials, legal ambushes, her grasp weakened. Neighbors who once kept silent began whispering thanks to the homeowner, even openly bringing him food and support. In 1 week, her rule rotted from within, exposed as self-interest disguised as community leadership. By the end, her grand finale, a staged raid with trucks and men in reflective vests, collapsed in humiliation when a sheriff arrested her for violating a restraining order. Tyrannies built on swagger can survive committee meetings, but they cannot survive cameras, law, and the eyes of defiant neighbors. Taken together, these themes make the blackout more than a story of one feud. It becomes a parable about what sustains power and what erodes it. Preparedness outlasts entitlement, sovereignty outlasts hollow authority, generosity outlasts coerced control, reality outlasts illusion, and tyranny eventually collapses under its own weight. The homeowner did not need to shout louder than Karen. He simply had to stand with patience, documentation, and quiet kindness. The blackout, like a crucible, stripped the neighborhood to essentials, burning away the paper empire of the HOA and leaving behind the truth that genuine strength lies in foresight, legality, and human decency. When the lights returned, it was not just a victory for one man's generator. It was the dawning awareness of an entire community that had seen through the illusions of false authority. At the heart of the blackout conflict stands the protagonist, a figure defined less by aggression and more by composure and foresight. He is not the sort of man who waits for disaster to reveal vulnerabilities. Long before the blackout, he had prepared with meticulous care, a properly permitted generator locked safely in a shed, fuel stored in containers that matched county codes, a decoy machine chained near the fence's bait, and cameras recording every angle of his property. Every step he took during the crisis followed the same principle. Stay calm, collect evidence, and let opponents implode on their own. This homeowner is less a warrior and more a strategist, a chess player sitting behind a board that others cannot even see, quietly moving pieces and refusing to overextend. In the chaos of Karen's shouting mobs, faux inspectors, and staged theatrics, he stood still, coffee in hand, letting her break herself against the wall of his patience. Across from him is Karen, the antagonist whose every move radiates entitlement and obsession. Karen does not embody villainy in the cinematic sense. Hers is the tyranny of bureaucracy, the small-scale despotism of an HOA leader who thrives by turning neighbors into subjects. 4 years before the blackout, she wielded bylaws and fines like weapons, enjoying the control they gave her. In the darkness, stripped of electricity and normal social routines, she saw her authority threatened in a way she could not ignore. The protagonist's house gleaming in the blackout became a symbol of everything she could not tolerate, independence beyond her reach. That envy and panic fused into her siege against the generator. She arrived in tracksuits with clipboards, staged raids with security, cut wires with pruning shears, and even marched with megaphones proclaiming ordinances that did not exist. But beneath all the noise was a simpler truth. She could not bear to see power, literal and symbolic, standing where hers had failed. Karen's character is a study in how obsession with authority bends perception until desperation feels like legality and control masquerades as community good. Orbiting Karen are her allies and accomplices, who serve as fragile extensions of her will. The nephew press-ganged into snapping photos in the freezing dark, the board members who played along with her declarations but clearly wished they were anywhere else, the so-called electrician cousin who tried to sabotage a generator under the cover of hedges. Each one represents not conviction but compliance. They are pulled in by guilt, obligation, or intimidation, not belief. Their hesitations, dropping bolt cutters at the gate, mumbling excuses in front of a growing crowd, or retreating when sheriffs warned them, revealed that they were never truly allies at all, only unwilling players caught in Karen's orbit. Their visible discomfort, their whispered arguments, and their eventual desertion became part of the unraveling. Their weakness highlighted the isolation at Karen's core. Though she strutted with entourages, shouted with megaphones, and paraded clipboards, she was fundamentally alone in her mania. Looming far beyond individuals is the neighborhood itself, a silent but crucial character shaping the conflict. At first, neighbors peeked silently from behind curtains, watching the one glowing house in a sea of darkness with suspicion. They feared Karen's wrath too much to openly speak. Yet as the crisis deepened, and the protagonist shared freezer space for medicine, quietly recharged phones, and offered water, a subtle shift occurred. Gratitude outweighed fear. Those who had once swallowed Karen's proclamations began whispering thanks through fences, leaving plates of food at the gate, sending supportive texts. Each small act of neighborly acceptance chipped away at Karen's narrative that he was selfish and hoarding. The neighbors as a collective evolved from silent jury to passive allies of the protagonist, their slow drift of loyalty leaving Karen hollering to an ever-thinner echo. In this way, the neighborhood became the stage audience in her play, and their laughter, gasps, and quiet withdrawal of obedience became her downfall. Overshadowing both sides are the authorities: inspectors, deputies, and eventually the judge. Unlike Karen, they do not shout or posture. They measure, observe, and record, grounding the chaos in law. The inspector who calmly ticked boxes and confirmed the generator's legality, the sheriff's deputies who arrived just as another raid was staged, and the judge who listened without indulgence to Karen's courtroom theatrics. Each authority embodied the outside force of objectivity. They were unmoved by HOA bulletins, clipboards, or megaphones. Each one became a blow to Karen's fantasy world, reinforcing that property lines, laws, and documented evidence trump self-invented rules. If the homeowner's generator stood humming as the physical symbol of independence, the county courtroom and sheriff's badge became the institutional symbols of accountability. Together, they played the final decisive role that pierced Karen's papier-mâché empire. When these characters interact, the calm homeowner, the obsessive Karen, her faltering accomplices, the shifting neighborhood, and the impartial authorities, the Blackout reads less like an inconvenience and more like a morality play. The protagonist becomes the still axis, the one figure who resists being swept into chaos. Karen spirals, shouting and staging more elaborate scenes, her allies cracking under the strain, the neighbors shifting toward quiet solidarity, and the authorities reinforcing the boundaries of reality. Each role magnifies the others. His calm makes her noise absurd, her theatrics make his patience heroic, their treachery makes his foresight sharper, and the neighborhood's gradual drift reveals that legitimacy is not commanded but earned. In the end, the Blackout is not remembered as one man protecting his generator but as a theater of human nature under stress. The characters, strategist, tyrant, accomplices, jury, and judges, turn a simple outage into a story about how power is exercised, tested, and toppled. The homeowner stood not as a conqueror but as a steady anchor, while Karen unraveled from queen bee to desperate figure behind shuttered blinds. Each character left their mark, but together they tell the timeless truth. When pressure comes, preparation and composure outlast noise and coercion, and leadership cannot be seized by shouting. It must be sustained by legitimacy, respect, and reality. From the very first flicker of darkness, the protagonist understood that the Blackout would not only be a test of endurance but also a test of legality. When the grid collapsed and his generator became the sole source of light and sound on the block, he knew Karen would come. And when she arrived, flashlight in hand, clipboard clutched like a warrant, demanding that the generator be declared community property, the narrative shifted instantly from petty neighbor drama to a question of property rights. Her shouting at the gate, her hands tugging at locked cords, and her threats to bring authorities were not just bluster. They were acts of trespass. The protagonist pressed the button that locked the gate and allowed her fury to be recorded in full view of surveillance cameras. Already, the groundwork for a legal defense was forming. Clear evidence that she had crossed into territory beyond her authority. The key to his strategy was documentation. While Karen raged, he quietly cataloged every moment. Security cameras caught her pawing at cords, yelling into the dark, and pacing with allies. A logbook in his home recorded times, weather conditions, and incidents. His phone captured live footage of accomplices attempting to lift fence panels or drill open locks. Each small act, left unchecked, could have devolved into he said, she said. But with evidence, each trespass became undeniable fact. Instead of matching Karen's shouting, He let digital clarity speak for him. In a conflict defined by noise and fear, evidence became his shield and weapon. Karen's next tactic, tampering with property, only tightened the legal noose around her. She dispatched 2 allies in the night to cut cables and pry at the chains of the decoy generator. Cameras caught them in the act, expressions frozen like deer when floodlights hit, fleeing in panic as alarms blared. Her cousin, the so-called electrician, crept along the hedge line with bolt cutters, muttering to himself under the hum of the machine, only to be exposed again on camera. Later, Karen herself was filmed with pruning shears trying to sabotage the inverter cords that powered her neighbors' phones and medical devices. Each incident was not merely a moral offense but a legal one: attempted theft, trespass, and destruction of private property. Far from weakening him, each move strengthened his case. By staying patient and recording instead of retaliating, the protagonist let Karen generate her own evidence of guilt. Meanwhile, the protagonist's generator was not some outlaw contraption. It was fully permitted infrastructure. He had fire inspection certificates, county approvals, receipts of purchase, and years of maintenance records, all stored neatly in a folder. When a real county inspector arrived, prompted by one of Karen's complaints, the protagonist simply opened the gate, guided him to the shed, and presented every document. The inspector checked noise levels, fuel storage, ventilation, and wiring, nodding as he ticked boxes off his form. His verdict was clear: everything was within code. That professional assessment served not only as reassurance, but as a stark contrast to Karen's fabricated emergency ordinances and HOA flyers taped to gates. In legal confrontations, substance outweighs theater, and in this case, substance belonged entirely to the homeowner. Inevitably, the escalation reached its peak in the courtroom. Frustrated by failed raids, failed sabotage, and failed inspections, Karen filed an emergency motion demanding that the court seize the generator for HOA use under community necessity. In the dimly powered courthouse, she launched her most dramatic performance, voice trembling as she painted herself as the savior of infants, the protector of elders, and the crusader against selfishness. But dramatics do not withstand scrutiny. The homeowner's lawyer responded with calm precision, laying out a timeline of her trespasses, submitting footage of her cousin's sabotage attempts, and introducing video of Karen herself crouched with pruning shears in the dark. He stacked permits and inspection records before the judge like stone pillars, unshakable, unemotional proof of legality. He buttressed the case with sworn statements from neighbors who testified that, far from hoarding, the protagonist had opened his gates for medicine, charging stations, and freezer storage. The contrast was devastating. Karen's cries of emergency collapsed before images of her cutting wires, lying in HOA bulletins, and orchestrating fake raids. The verdict was decisive and crushing. The court denied her motion outright, issued a restraining order preventing her from approaching within 100 feet of the homeowner's property, and scheduled hearings for harassment and trespass damages. For Karen, the hearing marked not just a legal defeat but a moral exposure. In front of her board, her allies, and the very neighbors she claimed to defend, her authority was revealed as hollow. Her authority, once bolstered by fear of fines and intimidation at HOA meetings, was dismantled by the steady application of law, documentation, and evidence. The aftermath showed just how powerful legality can be when wielded with preparation. Neighbors, once wary, now openly approached the homeowner, offering thanks and respectful nods. His legitimacy was not earned through shouting matches or intimidation but through calm consistency, documented fact, and the unshakable certainty of property law. Even the sheriff's deputies began treating the repeated calls from Karen as routine disturbances, expecting to receive fresh camera footage whenever she tried her next move. Karen's clipboard, once a symbol of petty supremacy, now seemed laughably irrelevant compared to flash drives stacked with legal evidence. Thus, the Blackout saga, seen through a legal lens, is less a feud than an airtight case study. From entry and trespass, to property tampering, to documentation discipline, to official inspections, and finally to a courtroom ruling, every step turned chaos into clarity. Karen thought control could be seized with clipboards and megaphones, but the homeowner proved that true authority lies in law, preparation, and documented fact. What began as a tantrum at a locked gate ended in a restraining order, and what began as a Blackout feud became a legal reckoning that dismantled her paper empire brick by brick. Beneath the surface of the Blackout drama lies a story thick with symbolism, as though each object and event carried a message larger than itself. The most central symbol is the generator, humming steadily through the darkness. For the protagonist, it stands as the pure embodiment of preparation, foresight, and independence. It is not just a machine powering lights, it is the reward of quiet work long before crisis struck, the steady heartbeat of self-reliance. For Karen, however, the generator became a symbol of everything she despised. Sovereignty she could not regulate, stability she could not command, and power she could not seize. To her, the lights glowing across the street were an insult to her perceived authority, a taunt in the middle of darkness. Thus, the machine became the story's crown jewel, representing resilience for one, and lost control for the other. If the generator serves as the heart of independence, the gate functions as the line of sovereignty. Strong, locked, and recorded by cameras, the gate symbolizes the immovable boundary between one person's lawful control over their property and another's obsession with overreach. When Karen and her allies rattled the chain, paraded with flashlights and vests, or wielded bolt cutters in the night, they were not simply trying to bypass hardware. They were trampling against the idea that a legitimate boundary exists to limit them. The gate answered back not with speeches but with unyielding strength, turning attempts at forced entry into self-incriminating evidence. In allegorical terms, the gate is the wall between illusion and truth. Her proclamations bounced off it, while his preparation fortified it. Each time the gate stood firm, it reminded everyone watching that sovereignty cannot be undone by clipboards or megaphones. It must be respected. No less symbolic was Karen's clipboard and megaphone, which throughout the siege came to embody hollow authority. In daylight meetings, those tools had once given her power. Writing fines, noting violations, declaiming rules for shutters and hedges. Wielded in the Blackout, however, those same props looked absurdly fragile. The clipboard paper fluttered uselessly in the storm. The megaphone squealed with feedback during her nighttime parades. They symbolized the reliance on performance, theatrical domination, that collapses when the backdrop of everyday life falls away. Karen genuinely believed holding a clipboard or rehearsing bylaws gave her command, but set against the hum of a generator and the clarity of security footage, such symbols exposed themselves as costumes. They did not actually confer power. They only pretended to. In the allegorical mirror, her props showed how authority without real legitimacy is an empty costume that eventually tears at its seams. When the conflict reached the courtroom, the symbolism deepened further. The dimly lit courthouse, buzzing with its own emergency generator, became less a location and more a stage for truth. Karen's theatrics filled the air, trembling speeches about saving infants, accusations of hoarding, but they sounded hollow before the judge's bench. The protagonist's lawyer, unfolding permits, showing inspection certificates, and playing video footage, introduced symbols of clarity. Stone documents, official stamps, timestamps burned into images. These were not props, but pillars. In allegorical terms, the courtroom became the crucible where illusion was burned away and fact remained. Karen raised her voice. The law raised its gavel. In that echo, the meaning was unmistakable. Survival of authority requires evidence, not performance. The neighborhood itself became the silent jury and final symbolic layer. At first, neighbors hiding behind curtains represented fear, the quiet compliance that allowed Karen's power to survive for years. Yet as the Blackout stretched on, the shift was visible. Each cooler of medicine accepted into the protagonist's freezer, each phone charged discreetly by his inverter, each plate of food left at his gate, all became symbolic acts of dissent. Neighbors were no longer passive. They were quietly voting against Karen's tyranny with every whisper of gratitude. By the final failed raid, when she returned with reflective vests and clipboards, their laughter and open filming revealed the last symbolic transformation. The community had seen behind her mask. They were no longer afraid of her paper bullets. For the first time in years, their silence cracked into solidarity. Not in shouting, but in choosing whom to trust. Taken together, the symbols transform the story from a private spat into an allegory of power and truth. The generator is not just a machine but the manifestation of earned independence. The gate is not just steel but the principle that freedom requires boundaries. The clipboard is not just stationary but the illusion of power built on theater rather than substance. The courtroom is not just procedure but the one place where truth inevitably overrules performance. And the neighborhood is not just a collection of houses but the collective conscience that finally turns away from fear to acknowledgement. The allegorical lesson is simple but powerful. Preparation will always shine brighter than false authority. Boundaries matter more than bluster. And true community comes not from control but from generosity. Karen marched with props, paraded with followers, and shouted until her voice cracked, yet ended exposed and arrested. The protagonist drank coffee on his porch and waited. One built noise, the other built substance. The blackout stripped away the world's glossy distractions and spotlighted who each really was. And as the lights returned across the town, what endured was not Karen's rules or theatrics, but the quiet, steady symbols of sovereignty, preparedness, and genuine community that can never truly be commandeered.